So I just took a little nap here, and I think I'm ready to tackle this next phase. We really cracked into the metaphysical code of existence and creation using our modern science, using our history of philosophy, and using our history of culture, particularly baseball. And I think a lot about, or I have recently thought a lot about my cultural upbringing, which is an intersection somewhere between Nietzsche and Freud and Russian literature and Marx, along with Slam magazine, and One, the Starbury shoes, the Shacks, right? These are kind of classic early 2000s staples, NBA Live 2003, and the different cards, right? We've discussed baseball cards, but here I'm expanding it to basketball cards. There's a particular set from the late 90s from Fleer called Metal Universe, and it's a really fantastic set to me because it shows a lot of these kind of cosmic, almost Matrix-like, very esoteric but very creative and highly stylized cybernetic early 2000s, almost implicitly or explicitly citing the Matrix, a lot of the stuff with the cosmos. Very cool. There's these two that I was going to grab for this one. There's one with Kobe Bryant and Ken Griffey Jr. They're surrounded by the solar system and star systems, and there's a lot of depictions of energy and light and planets and stars, and even like prosthetic arms and attachments like second and third and fourth arms. Very creative, and it made me think a lot about like things like NBA Street in relationship to NBA Live 2003. There's a really profound creativity that we can associate kind of natively with sports, specifically the American cultural legacy of sports. There's a very deep, implicit, metaphysical cultural literacy when it comes to the ball sport and the history of the ball sport in America, as basketball and football become more popular in the mid to late 1900s and into the early 2000s. And again, here we're talking about the Heraclitian metaphysical blanket statement, the metaphysical generalization, which sums up in the ion is the child at play with colored balls. And again, when we think about atomic structure, cell structure, the solar system, these various different ways that we explicitly visualize waveforms and wave structures in space and time, we atomize physically the concrete physical structures of the universe. Even when we think about blood cells, the way that we seek to literalize them is through a kind of sacred geometry or an ideal form as described in the ancient Platonic philosophy. But again, it can in many ways, these waveforms can be ritualized into the form of a ball, right, or into the form of a sphere, a discrete packet, as much as a water molecule could be called a discrete packet carrying information in an ocean of water molecules. This is how we could distill at the highest level plasma as a form of cultural information, which is super social at the level of the cosmos, right? The cosmos itself is comprised over 99% of which it is plasma. But I want to kind of articulate this this hidden background that we experience, which is that profound form of creativity, which is driving us, especially in this playful youth-like sense. Again, when I experienced and won or experienced competitive sports throughout my childhood, the intuition by Camus of sports and the field of the sport itself, he's talking about European football, is that it builds camaraderie, it builds something inherently moral, inherently decent, and inherently courageous in the architecture of the human, in terms of the ability to collaborate and strive to achieve a common goal. And not only that, but to participate again in this implicit cultural literary form with the play of the cosmos. And this is something that's not really being articulated and understood yet, but when we look at human culture, and specifically when we look at human physical culture, and human ball sport culture, we're looking at some of the biggest and most important phenomena that are sort of politically decontextualized, that are philosophically or intellectually disregarded, that are aesthetically disregarded in the sense that they're seen as populist, democratic, and empty of meaning. That these are events that are by and for a proletarian group which is unconscious. And I think this is precisely the point. It's to bypass what so much of these academic and high aesthetic structures don't wish to realize about themselves, but the inanity of their construction, the power dynamics and systemization of status and control and knowledge, which composes really the entirety of their domain. It's a culture of the creation of social hierarchies, which is not to say that these aren't occurring in proletarian forms like baseball, but that rather these proletarian forms in terms of the democratic unconscious provide us with the most profound and powerful gateway and venue to view true human meaning. And again, I've stated this before and I'll state it again. It's that the idea is not to interpret history or to interpret humanity as much as to let humanity tell the tale of itself. And the importance of ball sports, specifically if we just want to localize it in American civilizational history, again, is a metaphysical literacy which I don't think we can bypass in terms of solving the fundamental problems of modernity and the dislocation in terms of when we talk about human purpose or human essence and the problems that we experience in modernity, including existentialist philosophy, political, social, cultural fragmentation, economic inequality, racial and ethnic dispute over land, territory, power, and status. All of these things can be reduced fundamentally to the essential problem of human meaning. And the issue with the problem of human meaning is that we have various different locales of intellectual engagement, which include quantum mechanics, quantum physics, modern philosophy, mathematics, all of these different realms in which we've made significant advancements toward a total ontology of existence. And these realms engage primarily through conquering and this idea of knowledge as an apparatus which will eventually tell us the truth, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but the issue with a lot of these fields is that these fields themselves are looking too far into the weeds of material phenomenological problems when they need to be looking structurally at a unitive theory which spans across all different disciplines that reveals to us the essential evolutionary structure or the building blocks of nature and existence themselves. And again, this is what is so important about Plato and the foundations of ancient Greek philosophy, which are lost to much of the history of Western philosophy and eventually redeemed very thoroughly, clearly, and concretely by Heidegger and Nietzsche in the latter part of the German philosophical revolution, which spans into the late 1800s and early 1900s. We're talking about the loss of a unified vision of existence and reality, which necessarily must ground itself foundationally and utterly in a real, as we discussed in the last essay, a real cultural ritual embodied practice, which itself is the summation and the representation and the reproduction of the universal powers, which then is an extension of the scales of existence. Right, this is an extension of the scales of existence, much in the terms of these Fleer metal universe cards, down through the spheres, which would be the sphere of the creation of the universe itself, into galactic formations, which are exchanging information via star systems, and then the gravitational pull and transfusion of energy through radiation, thermonuclear radiation, down through star systems via the star itself, which is the primary principle and guide of the the dance of the planets, so to speak, all of which are in various different space-time relationships to one another, vis-a-vis the field of gravity, which is their total presence, which is their atmosphere in that solar system itself proper, and then expanded outward again into galactic forms and neighborhoods, and then again the universal whole itself. So we're looking at time as an exploded map of space, which reveals to us various different spheres of information where this essential form of being, which is to say the creative play, Ion as a child at play with colored balls, the creative play of the recombinative creative play of the universe itself is representing itself over and over and over again at different scalar points of relationship. So when we look at baseball, or a child playing with different various colored balloons at the zoo, we are looking most fundamentally not merely at a metaphor, not merely at a symbolization, but a primordial reproduction of the same energetic principles of creation that are described metaphysically in Heraclitus, but are represented cosmologically in the universal when we gesture up spheres and scales of existence into stellar nuclear synthesis, or the relative relationship between star systems and galaxies. We're looking at a delicate, almost kind of profound, superordinate balance between all of these different fields of gravity and their relationship at a grand cosmological level, as again this phenomenon of the aeon or the ion as a child at play with colored balls. And so we want to understand the profundity of this metaphysical presumption or metaphysical subsumption of all of existence into the character of existence itself, because what this conveys and confers down through the scales of existence is a deeper understanding than materialist science would allow, which is to say the supposition of the character of the universe is implicit and explicit in all of its creations, and thus the universe itself is always seeking to replicate, represent, and recreate this phenomenal aspect of play and incarnate it into existence. But again, the issue is an issue of translation. This is an issue of understanding and actually translating this primary creative impulse into existence. And again, we see this through all aesthetic production in humanity is the orientation toward the creative powers of existence. It's to bring something greater than the human structural narrative of consumption, reproduction, and production, let's say, into play via that inherently unstructured creative energy, which is latent and present in the human form, but again is being translated through this thermonuclear, thermodynamic possibility, which is the current linguistic status of the human being as it exists as a genetic form in space and in time. It's the evolutionary status. So when we're looking at, and a great metaphor for me is the kind of primal nature of the animal, wherein beneath it, what really the animal is concealing or protecting is this essential primordial energy, which is native to creation, which is being translated down through the organism, and the organism is attempting to preserve and pass this information forward. But rather, this is the essential information which is being tweaked at the smallest scale genetically across all different formulations of species proper, which they themselves are in various different stages of transmutation of this energy, which can be described most clearly as an articulation of it. And this the most kind of proximal description that we could have for this energy itself and its essence is love. Again, the child at play with colored balls is profoundly creative, essential, naive force, which is inherently harmless, but experimentational, inquisitive, inquiring as to the nature of itself, and experimenting with the recombinative possibilities of organizing and ordering these balls in different patterns to create different constructs. And again, when we look down at the genetic chain as it's popularly depicted, we see the various different nucleotides in that genetic chain are depicted as precisely as colored balls. So when we're looking at different representations of scale, we tend to be looking at spheres of representation, which are energetic packets, which are really waveforms that materialize in fields. So again, you could look at the electromagnetic field of the human being, the way that it represents itself in space, which is clearly, it's not necessarily natively visible to the human eye, is toroidal. But when that manifests itself in space in a toroidal way, it's a sphere of influence, which itself is a circle. Right? So this is a concept which is also profoundly manifest in the Jewish mystical tradition in reference to the Kabbalah of the Ein Sof, or the divine light, or the eternal light. And there are various different concentric circles through which that Ein Sof is represented. And so when we talk about these concentric circles, and again, when we talk about the metaphysical structure of the universe as scalar representations of this Heraclitean principle, we're talking about the essential poetry of science. And this is one of my favorite quotes by a physicist whose name I don't remember, who won a Nobel Prize. He said, what we're really looking for in science, in the most advanced and the highest form of science and physics, is the poetry of nature. And this is what is consistently understood among the most advanced physicists in human history, is that we're using science, much as the poet uses poetry, to reach an understanding. The poet goes within, much as Dante's descent into hell, whereas the physicist goes without. We could say Galileo's ascent into the universe. These are the same metaphysical journeys, or the metaphysical arcs into the above and the below, which are primordial representations and mirrors of one another across scales at the highest and the lowest, or the smallest and the greatest. And this is what these concentric circles in the Kabbalah represent. And this is precisely what Heraclitus's axiom represents. It represents a total knowledge, or a total essential character, which physics is looking to grasp outwardly and the poet is looking to grasp inwardly. And the primordial unity between the two of them is that essential character or nature of the energy, which is constructing phenomenological reality, and the experiential reality, which we would construct as the psychology of the organism or the animal or the human being. And so looking across these concentric circles, when we look at at the human being as an existential form in space-time, as an existential predicament, as an organism in a state of becoming where it has not reached necessarily its end, or nor does it know its beginning, truly understand itself, it's in medias res. It's a organism which is attempting to reach up through scales and grasp the cosmic, which is in kind of more Abrahamic sense constructed as God, that God is above, and to reach below and deduce the terms and conditions of that which is within it, the most kind of primary, the most fundamental, that which, again, right, cannot be seen because it's so small and because it's so mote, to, again, grasp the scales, which you could say are the microbiotic, right, the very bacterium which forms the human form in the most materialistic sense, but then also, again, the intergalactic relationship and network of systems, which they themselves insight into those systems, as well as insight into the most mote in terms of the human experience and the essential nature of the one who is perceiving, or the total makeup of the human organism, or even beneath that, the various different microorganismic relationships which compose the health and wellness and status of the planet Earth as an ecosystem. A grasping of all of these different terrains and terrariums, so to speak, of universal energetic form and source would allow for the necessary enlightenment of the species, of the individual, of the organism to occur in terms of its real relationship and status, again, as above in the highest sphere and below in the lowest sphere. And so there has been, you can see how this has been in Abrahamic traditions, been constructed as a fear of death and denial of death in terms of a fear of hell, which is a fear of the descent into form, the imprisonment within form and the imprisonment within structure of the existence and the essence of the spirit, which has been cast down from God. And it really, all that this is to say that in a scalar way, the universal source of energetic creation, which is the essential character as described by Heraclitus, has been over space and over time transmuted into the energetic form of the human being with its necessary limitations and its visionary sealing or sealing of vision, which has, again, forgotten God, which is that separation between this essential character of playfulness and the current status of the human being. And so you can think of this in many ways insofar as we know the known universe, that the human being itself is isolated or stranded in this existential predicament of the revelation of this creative, playful character of being, and the true return to that, which is represented most clearly, again, in childhood, as Heraclitus uses in his symbolization of the essential character of creation. This is a moment in which the human being itself is almost not aware of life and death as principles or possible realities or thermodynamic potentialities. The child itself is unaware of the status of the human being itself whatsoever, and is experiencing primarily the creative powers which have not yet been reduced to object drives in terms of sexuality, which is to say the drive or the will of the organism has not yet been fundamentally directed towards a sexual object, which is to say the reproductive mode of existence that most human adults as animals understand as their primary drives and impulses, or the drive towards social or political power as constructs which again exist between animals as methods of creating primordial accumulation, creating status symbols, and organizing their known universe within a cultural pocket. So when we're talking about experiencing this primary creative energy and living within this primary creative energy, that's what's, to bring this back to the Metal Universe cards with Kobe Bryant and Ken Griffey Jr. kind of playing among the solar system and playing among the stars, is that when we look at the ancient Greek mythology, the concept of the hero, the essential teleological arc of heroism, ends with the hero being placed up in and among the stars. And what this represents, beyond a sort of deification into the godship or the god realm, which would be called Mount Olympus, is a reunion with these most powerful and primordial forms of elucidation of cosmic existence, which is stellar nucleosynthesis, which in terms of the ancients, when they gaze up at the stars, there is this simultaneous understanding, right, of the impelling and compelling powers of the sun as a form of nutritive radiation for the human being, which creates and constructs and reaps and sows the harvests, which are the cycles that preserve and sustain the human being. It's the essential metabolic powers of human existence are emerging from this star. But also, furthermore, that the stars themselves above are the representations and manifestations of the Godhead, and the various different constellations of them are symbolic architecture for understanding the Godhead in various different archetypal dimensions, whether that's Perseus or Hercules or Ares, right? To understand the creative powers that are emergent from the Godhead, which themselves, much like different species that populate the planet Earth, have different energetic principles depending on their wavelength formation or wave formation. And this is where we get so much deeper into psychology and the psyche and the foundation of consciousness and the importance of the metaphysical project in terms of identifying and essentially identifying with, as in terms of being incarnate, the metaphysical character of creation itself as articulated by Heraclitus, the child at play with colored balls. Because to assume this status of creation, to assume the status of consciousness, which is essentially nothing more, nothing less than a total return to childhood and a total return to the expression of the inherent primordial creative energy through the aperture of the human being as itself, first and foremost, creation and creational energy, is to suggest. Let's see how I can articulate this. Is to suggest that transcendental reunion and being among the stars, which is itself a liberation, which is accomplished at the end of the Herculean trials, the 12 tasks and the 12 labors, which are symbolized by the zodiac, the zodiacal wheel, which again is common to most, if not really all, of the ancient civilizational architectures of humanity, as we are aware of them going back to the Babylonians. It is a return in terms of the task of being human to the revelation of the essential primordial energy of the will that resides beneath the human impulses or genetic language, which seats that will and directs that will and translates that will upon and among the earth, as in that which we know as the everyday circumstance and condition of the human being, which is articulating unconscious energies through itself. And again, this is where we go back to consciousness, is to understand that primordial identity is to have that reunion among the stars, which is, as it is understood in the ancient Greek, the reunion of the cosmic primordial heroism. And this is what's so powerful about having Ken Griffey Jr. or Kobe Bryant on these Metal Universe cards playing among these solar systems and these stars, is that there's this implicit metaphysical cultural literacy inherent within American civilization, which is a deeply unconscious resonance. Again, at the root of Western civilization, we gesture toward the Greeks and the Egyptians and the ancient Indians by that nature, but we're not going to go all the way into that. And this primordial, like this deep resonance that exists historically and culturally here between America and Greece, in this understanding that much as maybe we have the athletic and heroic feats of Hercules, or even someone like Plato as the wrestler, right? Plato is actually embodying in his philosophical life this fundamental architecture of the harnessing of the metabolic will toward the aesthetic object of play, wrestling much less without the colored balls, which are very integrated into American cultural history and the cultural legacy of sports in American civilization. But to see Kobe Bryant, right, in this participatory act with the basketball rising towards the net, or Ken Griffey Jr. leaping to catch the baseball among the stars, we're understanding that there is actually a profound event that has happened here in American history and American civilization, which is happening, right? Which is actually a great deal of, if not all of, American civilizational culture. When we think about Slam Magazine or And One, this was a huge part of the millennial culture in American history and American civilization, which was the explosion of the intersection of Black history and Black culture with the athletic history of basketball and the immersion of the history of basketball with hip-hop culture and rap culture, and the aesthetics that were produced from them is a entire realm of aesthetic creative play and possibility, as you see in NBA Street 1 and 2, which are actually a kind of a profound artifacts of Black futurism in America. Just as you would see with these Metal Universe cards, there's a profound understanding that's emerging through American history, unconsciously through the history of sport, which is a cultural artifact which in itself creates this entire aesthetic dimension of participation, including video games, sneakers, different brands, magazines with their cultural voices. And one of the most important things, and I'll see if I can work this in here, and I think I will, is that the Shaq shoes, as well as the Starbury shoes, these were shoes that could be purchased for $15 at the Walmarts or the Kohl's, the big box stores in America, which served those in need, those who experienced various different socioeconomic status. And what was so powerful about these shoes is their profound act of social and political consciousness, which we've discussed a lot with baseball, but we're also tying basketball into it a little bit now, with Stephon Marbury and Shaquille O'Neal creating these brands where parents who had children, let's say in an inner city environment or were highly impoverished in a rural environment, could not afford the shoes, specifically basketball shoes, to go and play this sport, to participate in this metaphysical legacy, which consciously or unconsciously is unfolding at this point as a primary artifact of civilization across baseball, basketball, and football, as the sort of big three Abrahamic religions of American civilizational cultural history, so to speak, in terms of the aesthetic theater of the elucidation of the Heraclitian axiom, right? So these sneakers were created as this profound act of socioeconomic responsibility and understanding as to what basketball, and specifically Shaquille O'Neal and Stephon Marbury and basketball shoes, represent in Black culture and Black history and American civilizational history in terms of the possibility of participation, much as we've talked about in terms of racial exclusion in baseball and Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige. The possibility of the participation in what American civilization has created, which extends far beyond the intellectual legacy of much of European philosophical history, Western philosophical and intellectual history itself, and even Eastern philosophical history itself, which again I would put this toward perhaps maybe the most clear and profound elucidations would be the Bhagavad Gita or the Tao, in the sense that we are looking at a participatory universe where America itself has created the cultural scaffolding in these three distinctly American cultural forms, all of which are founded in and find their world historical epicenters in American civilization. Baseball, basketball, football, these ball sports, which to varying degrees, again, are high aesthetic sports of the dedication of the assertion of the will towards an aesthetic object, which is to say the ball. Football itself being the most Roman, which is to say the most high contact and violent, which itself resonates with the sphere of American culture and American political and social consciousness. Basketball being one of the most powerful and physical, yet the most entirely dedicated to the ball itself, with very, very minimal physical contact. And then I would say culminating in baseball as the most difficult physical act in terms of hitting a baseball in American cultural and civilizational history, which represents a profound embodied unity, which we are no longer discussing and attempting to elucidate the fine mathematically gradated formulae of phenomenal space and phenomenal time, and to deduce the impacts of consciousness on existence, but rather we are participating, and this is a participatory cultural revelation and artifact, which is the cultivation of an understanding in American civilizational history of what really matters and what really is important. And I think what we see in American civilization, which is so profound and so particular, is that there is a extreme dedication toward these three ball sports, and an extreme dissociation and almost irrelevance of American history. I mean, we do see political participation and moments of profound social revolutions, such as Occupy Wall Street or the Black Panthers or the protests against the Vietnam War. We do see a high level of political involvement in certain pockets and moments in American history, but I think for the most part, a lot of the existential vacuum that is experienced in modernity itself is the most clearly incarnated in the political situation in America in terms of political apathy. And I don't think this is necessarily a coincidence. I think this is directly tied to the implicit metaphysical cultural literacy of American civilization and its orientation progressively and increasingly toward these sports, not as Juvenal says in ancient Rome, is that not as a bread or a circus, not as a way of distracting the populace while the political sphere of elites, plunders, and attempts to ideologically consume the labor and the system, the possible systems that could support the welfare of that populace. I think rather this is a populist orientation towards the truth. Meanwhile, you have a significant portion of the population, well, I guess an insignificant portion of the population, which is dedicated toward pushing forward this force of will into pursuits of instituting political power, social control, allocation of resources. This is all it's a misconstruing, which again resides between, and I would say Stephon Marbury's shoes as well as Shaquille O'Neal's shoes stand right in the middle of this, is the heroic act of the athletic will toward reunion with the universal whole, as the heroic act of Hercules and the return to the stars, so to speak. And this is not a literal return to the stars as in flying a spaceship and sitting next to one. This is a return to the stars in terms of reunion of the creative essence of the universe itself toward the higher metaphysical object of creation, symbolized by the star system. So we're looking at basically a political reality, which again is this meaningless consumption and this metabolic vampirism in the attempt to sustain life, and preserve it and protect it and remain it safe, which is the pull down toward the animal instinctual consciousness and the unconscious nature, and then the rise up through American civilization of these three major ball sport artifacts, which themselves are the metaphysical ontological thrust of creation itself towards its own self-revelation, explicitly or implicitly, through participation in these artifacts, right? Because in participation with these artifacts, what we're doing fundamentally is reuniting the metabolic architecture of the human being and the human organism, which is cloaked in all of these different genetic constructs and desires and systems of processing information, which are the perceptual aperture of the human being. We're reuniting that source energetic, again, as we discussed in the last episode, code breaking that source energetic and reuniting it existentially and essentially with the primordial will, the primordial will system itself, which creates and produces it at its fundament, as elucidated by Heraclitus in his axiom. And so one of the few things that we can take historically as truth is this Heraclitean axiom, because it is an axiom that can be approached from any dimension. If you want to approach it culturally, if you want to approach it historically, if you want to approach it scientifically through any of the different scientific disciplines, including genetics, including astrophysics, including cell biology. There's various different ways, even if we wanted to approach it via the study of oceans. There's various different ways to understand this essential Heraclitean axiom and filter it and interpret it through these various different scales and spheres of existence. But what is most important in a human being sense is that this Heraclitean axiom is subsumed in the very architecture of the human being experience itself, in the way that the will is purged or purgated or transformed through this ritual cultural play, which reproduces the deeply pure and essential childlike form of the eternal playing with colored balls in space and in time. And to understand this metaphysical playfulness is not merely metaphor, not simply metaphor at all, but rather the essential characteristic reality of being and existence itself, hid behind these various different phenomenological screens, which are these various metabolic forms attempting to achieve a level and space of evolutionary revolution of the self, to and for which this essential creative energy and power can emerge safely and thus be revelated, right? Because these phenomenological forms and these phenomenological beings are essentially shells. They're shells that are carrying forward genetic architecture, DNA information, and passing this information forward. But the question is why? What is the teleology behind evolution? And the statement here, just essentially and foundationally, I think indisputably, is the revelation of the essential and the native creative energy itself, which is behind the structural formation of phenomenological reality. That the process of reality is an articulation, but that articulation is becoming increasingly sophisticated, right? And realistically, when we look at the great and long span of evolution itself, this sophistication is occurring primordially and primarily unconsciously, which is why I say we don't interpret history and we don't interpret humanity. We allow history and humanity to articulate themselves and actually listen to that articulation, as opposed to attempting to establish constructs and rules upon reality or upon experience, or attempt to direct humanity, but rather to allow humanity to elucidate itself. And in its own self-elucidation, it's actually performing the very metaphysical trajectory that evolution architectonically is gesticulating itself toward, which is this unity in the stars of the archetypal cosmic hero of Hercules performing his 12 labors, or Perseus slaying Medusa using the mirror of the shield to avoid being turned to stone. You have to understand these essential mythical and mythological architectures, much like the emergence of Heraclitus from ancient Greek history, are telling through the symbolic dimension, which again is the dimension of the poetic, and why the poetic is so important in this intersection with the physical. The intersection with the phenomenological is that when we're talking about physics, we're talking about poetry, in the sense that we're looking at scalar dimensions of reality, much as we talk about chemistry or biology. The importance is not to remain absorbed or turned to stone or stuck within these narrative systems and these narrative descriptors of reality, these domains, which themselves are spheres or substratum within the larger architectural reality of existence in the universe itself, but rather to grasp the essential and fundamental nature, the superstructural architecture, the metaphysics of each of these interdimensional systems, and to realize the essential character within all of them, which Heraclitus was able to do thousands of years ago, without any real knowledge of Newtonian physics, but rather through observation, deduction, and translation of the movement and the patterns of the universe as he could observe through the relatively kind of latent and primal ancient Greek technology, which primarily had to do fundamentally with experience through very limited and narrow technological and prosthetic apertures. So all of this is to say that this information is already an inherently native to the human being, and we see the Heraclitean revelation being reproduced in American civilization and culture at large, primarily unconsciously. It's the same revelation, but America is putting the Heraclitean revelation into practice. And what American civilization is, so much of American history is focused on political movements and political moments and economic struggles, so to speak, or the elucidation of industrialization or globalization filtered through the American lens. This is typically how we interpret human history. But with this essential axiom in hand and in tow, what instead we do and we see, and what American history reveals to us, is that rather American history is just this larger driving force of this deeper teleological ontology, this deeper drive through and toward this object at the end of history, which is the child playing with colored balls, the realization of this form politically in space and in time, and a reunion in terms of the locking of this last piece into place of this jailbreaking of the genetic architecture of the human being as a revelation of the essential will, which is to say the child at play with colored balls, and the dedication of this will toward the aesthetic object, which is the revelation of this will itself into space and into time, and that all of history and existence, just the same as we talk about a leopard as a force of nature, these are essential drives which are all driving toward that same revelation, but are being filtered toward the current status of the organism's genetic architecture, and thus its ability to express and its expression in relation to that essential axiom, which is revelation. And so when we see human history driving towards this in cultural movements such as, let's say, Slam Magazine or NBA Street or Stephon Marbury with his shoes, we're looking at these cultural articulations of a profound realization and recognition that all of humanity and human history is headed towards this profound form of aesthetic play, right? This profound form of experimentational aesthetic play. And that when you have these moments such as the early 2000s with And One, and their colorful slogans, which were attached to the And One brand figure, which looked a little bit like a mannequin or a marionette performing various different feats with the basketball, like dunking the ball or crossing over. We're looking at just this deep unconscious but deeply true. And NBA Street, again, is a great example. The animated players moving in space and performing these gravity-defying feats of jumping and spinning and flipping and dunking. We're looking at this kind of defiance of the will, which is so typical of this evolutionary history of the will, which is to say, the revelation of the will out from under itself is always already a defiance of the existing form and architecture through which it is being articulated, and this is the purpose of higher revelation, which is understood in quantum mechanics, which is to say, higher revelation is that which changes the form and the field of being. It's the revelation of the essential, the metaphysical axiom of Heraclitus, out from under the phenomenological appearance of the form, which is the genetic translation of what was hitherto possible. And thus, evolutionarily, consciousness as a form and a force of recognition, which is primarily psychic. And you can relate this first and foremost to plasma as a field generator and circulator of consciousness. Plasma itself being the network through which information is being translated and moves, in that which plasma is the entirety of the universe, with the exception of under 1% of all information that is circulating in existence. We are looking at a fluid network of revelation, which is being translated down through limited phenomenological architecture, which is genetic transfusion of information through space and through time, through reproduction, which is being informed and nurtured, nutritived through stellar radiation, which itself is a direct primordial reflection of the essential powers of the human being itself. But the human being itself is phenomenologically translated down through scales. This is a rearrangement at scales. So these are profound moments when we look at, again, particularly that early 2000s period that I'm discussing, as well as the exponential rise of the power of the ball sport in American civilizational history, where basketball and football at mid-century joined baseball in rapid acceleration into primary cultural artifact and theater. And I described this towards the end of the 1950s, which I would kind of mark with the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants leaving New York. Baseball ceases effectively to become America's pastime because of the rise of popularity of basketball and football. Again, these are different atmospheres of the same experiential, experimentative mode of the child at play with colored balls. And that this is the vast majority of what actually constructs early childhood experience in American culture and civilization at large. And so what I'm saying here is very important, is that to look at American civilizational history, this is really primarily what we're looking at. And what's secondary is the political, economic, and social history, which colors that primary fundamental metaphysical realization, which might be taken as metaphor, but really is to be taken in a grand evolutionary sense, which is to say a transhuman sense, beyond the human into the larger cosmological architecture of all of the evolution of existence and the universe itself, down through scales, as a seeding of that revelation at the smallest scale, at the sort of atomic structure of creation in the universe itself, which is to say the culture of human play. And this is a primordial reunification in terms of the embodied revelation of the Heraclitean axiom, which goes beyond necessarily any sort of knowledge and must necessarily, whether or not this is implicit or explicit, conscious or unconscious, be grounded in the embodied experience, which is the existential experience of the human being, which is the vacuum elucidated by existentialism in Western philosophical history in the 1950s. So this is the moment that they are the existentialists with Camus and Sartre, as well as in many ways Heidegger, are articulating this vacuum and this void, this night of history, in the precise moment that on American soil, again, right, Camus, Sartre, and Heidegger are European intellectuals. They're articulating this profound void at the seat and at the heart of the history of Western phenomenology, and I would also argue at the heart of Eastern phenomenology, although they deal with it differently. They deal with that revelation at the level of being, not at the level of participation. How to be in the world is the question of Western philosophical history at this moment in time, articulated quite clearly in practice by World War II. This question, while it is being elucidated on European soil, is being resolved in an embodied, primal, foundational, elemental, physical way on American soil through the culture of ball sports. And Heidegger's obsession with Heraclitus is no coincidence, because he intuits, much like American modern civilization intuits, that Heraclitus is the solve to this issue of the dispersing or the breaking up or the fragmentation of the disciplines, that the metaphysician necessarily in the deduction and the observation and the revelation of the metaphysical architecture of all of these different now disparate systems of information and systematizing, which is to say biology, chemistry, math, astrophysics, that we've lost the true embodied singularity within history and within time, which is the eternal embodied human experience. We've lost that if we've ever had it, and the question is how to embody it, incarnate it through this true fundamental elemental knowledge, which is being in the world, being in practice, being in space, being in time, as a participatory revelation. And this is what the Heraclitean fragments are about as axioms, is that they are revelatory deductions of the universal process itself as a metaphysical archetype, and then is translated down through the different symbolic dimensions or archetypal dimensions, which could be described as a form of universal poetics, in that the essential nature and character is being translated through various different degrees of obfuscation and difficulty, as in articulation, down through these different scales and spheres, which we've described: the atomic structure, cell structure, the solar system, the human being. This is the great question of the solve that's inherent within humanity. And the difficulty is, again, that these biological, hormonal, chemical, elemental constructs which compose the phenomenological architecture of the human being, which are the direction and articulation and elucidation of the will as it occurs in and through the human species, are being taken as truth. And to take those as truth, as opposed to orient them back through the aesthetic object, and thus to purify and purgate them as a cultural practice, and thus to understand the inherent essence and innate nature of the will itself, the willing nature through the organism, which is manifest again through this language. To understand the energy, or as Samuel Beckett would say, the fire beneath that language, is to come into this reunion with the stars, which I think is so beautifully elucidated in these Fleer Metal Universe cards with Ken Griffey Jr. and Kobe Bryant. So this is really the profound revelation that we're talking about here, and that is occurring. So I hope you enjoy this one. I'll catch you on the next one.